And good evening. I'm Marty Olsen, and welcome to City Focus. And tonight I'm delighted to have an old friend on as my guest, and we're going to discuss. I don't know. I think we'll have a history lesson tonight.
Partly history.
And I'd like to welcome Bob Bernstein, and
Pleasure being here.
we're going to have a kind of a free-form conversation. And one thing I like to do with guests, especially those who either are new or haven't been on in a while, as an introduction, is to, where'd you come from?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1945, which means I'll be 80 next week. Not that it's a big number, but it's a big number.
Well, it is a big number.
Yeah, it is. But I was born in Brooklyn and lived there, went through the school system in New York, as well as through high school, and feel that I could not have gotten a better education than the New York school system was, especially in those days. It was really excellent. And most of my old friends who are still alive are Brooklynites, and very few people realize what a big city it would have been if it was defined as a city. Because it's a borough, one of the 5 boroughs of New York, in the day that I grew up, there were over 3 million people, which would have made it the 3rd largest city in America.
At that time? Or
At
today?
that time. Today it's probably in the top 5, I would assume, but it was bigger then. A lot of immigrants, a lot of people from all over the world identified themselves eventually as Brooklynites. And for me, the best identification was the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Now, would you say at that time that you had your ethnic neighborhoods in Brooklyn?
Oh, absolutely. I lived in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. My high school, which was a very large high school, Sheepshead Bay High School, had about 3,000 students. There were about 1,300 in my graduating class, more than many schools combined in Connecticut. And our neighborhood, the apartment building that I grew up in and lived in until I was 18 years old, was predominantly Jewish. If you went a few blocks in one direction or another, it was a big Italian neighborhood, or a growing Hispanic neighborhood, or a small, in those days, a relatively small African American neighborhood. But Brooklyn was a borough made of ethnic groups that, one way or another, managed to live together and do pretty well.
Yeah. My grandfather, my father's father, came from the old country. He had a brother who lived in Brooklyn.
Oh.
And I guess it was a small Norwegian neighborhood,
Community,
and he
yeah.
was a dentist.
Oh.
So he was a professional. He had a summer home out on Long Island, which I
Oh.
guess was rather extravagant for the
It
times.
certainly was. It certainly was. I always say that you interview many men when they were in their 60s and 70s, long past living in Brooklyn, living in different parts of the country or whatever, but you run into them and you mention Brooklyn and their eyes light up and they say, "It's the best years of my life." The joke is, if you interview their wives would say, "Oh no, it wasn't Brooklyn, it was moving to Long Island," like they were moving up a class. But for the men, nothing was better than the years they spent in Brooklyn.
Well, you had just alluded to the Dodgers before I rudely cut you off to mention my family in there. But
Oh, you didn't cut me off.
but
I lived and died, as many of my compatriots of my age in those days. Just loved the Dodgers. It was truly a community team. It was a day when they weren't making millions and millions of dollars. Just about every Dodger during the off season in the winter worked in Brooklyn at various jobs. I remember reading where Carl Furillo, the right fielder for the Dodgers, He was one of the builders of the World Trade Center. He spent every winter working those jobs. And of course, having Jackie Robertson and Campanella, that breaking the barrier, the color barrier, was substantial and very significant, not only for Brooklyn but for the country. And it's amazing how they put together such a great team, a team that just had trouble competing with the Yankees. They finally beat them in '55, and then to my dismay and many others, in '57, they walked out on us, those bums.
Well, they were referred to the bums before that.
There were bums before then, but in my mind, they were never bums until they left. I redefined the term bum. And from that point on, I missed them terribly. I mean, I grew up with them, and they left when I was 12 years old, so I was still a young fella. And my identification then eventually went to the Mets for a short period of time, and then in high school with a close friend of mine who played shortstop for our baseball team, Rico Petrocelli. When he signed with the Red Sox, I most naturally affiliated with the Red Sox ever since, and I still do. And Fenway Park was very much like an Ebbets Field. Small, 30-something thousand seats, very homey, avid fans. So the Red Sox fit the bill for me, and still do.
Yeah, well, the Red Sox, from the time the Dodgers in the 50s, I mean, the Sox were awful until '67.
A long time. Yeah, until the
And
impossible
Dream Team in
year.
'67 is that was the beginning of what's known as Red Sox Nation.
That's right. That's right.
And I was 13, so it's funny, you were 12.
I was right. When the Dodgers left, that was in '57. So, I was at the 7th game of that World Series. Unfortunately, they didn't have a chance with Bob Gibson pitching for St. Louis. From the first pitch on, you knew the game was almost over. He just dominated, unfortunately. And to have Yastrzemski have a Triple Crown year, you hope that they could have won a World Series.
Well, it was still exciting.
It was.
It was a 4-team racing. And that's to me, one of the sad things is that with the division makeup of all professional sports, and there's really no lines between the leagues. I mean, everything
That's
is
right.
kind of blended into
There's a blur, one big blur.
And you'll never, ever, ever have a pennant race.
Right. That's right.
Like you had in '67.
That's nothing.
Or
like
until they started breaking up the leagues into these divisions.
Into divisions.
And wild cards and
all of that, which has changed the game forever. It really has. I guess you could argue that with only, I believe, eight major league teams in each league in the early years, there were so many communities in the country that wanted baseball, professional baseball, but couldn't have it unless there was an expansion.
Yeah. Well, until the Dodgers and the Giants left New York.
Yes.
Professional baseball, I think professional sports stopped in St. Louis and the Mississippi.
That's right. That's right. It did. It took a great deal of effort to go from those original teams to expand. And now, of course, we see the consequence of that, both good and bad. I think there's both to be said.
Well, I think it's taken decades, and I would say it's in all sports, that in the early years of expansion, the system was loaded to see that the expansion teams were not good. They
Right.
didn't get good players, and it protected the existing teams. They didn't,
Right.
to a point where now you have a team like the Vegas Knights,
Right.
who I believe in their inaugural season, or perhaps second season, played in the Stanley Cup Finals.
Right. Right. which is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to me that was like, I got to follow these guys. This is something.
This is unusual. That's so true. But getting back to Brooklyn, it was just a unique place. Growing up there, when I was in my early teens, my friends and I would ride our bicycles anywhere and everywhere. And we'd be out late at night on weekends. I mean, 11, 12 for 15-year-old kids. And our parents had no qualms that we were in any danger of any kind. Like today, most parents would never allow their kids to be riding their bike at midnight somewhere.
Riding their bikes, period.
Or riding their bikes, period. Exactly. You have helicopter parents now, and there's a reason for it. There are things to be worried about and concerned about. But in those years, in these ethnic communities, it was safe. It really, really was. To ride your bike or to get on public transportation, to take the bus or take the subway. And as young teenagers, we went everywhere. It reminds me of one place we used to love to go, my friends and I, when we were probably 16, 17 years old. We'd go to night court in Brooklyn. In those days, night court, any kind of person in the world you can meet there, from from people who were just outwardly drunk, to prostitutes, to breaking and entering people. The police officers would bring them into the court late at night, 10, 11 o'clock. A judge would be there, and you listen to them making their pleas, and they get their sentence and everything else right there. And we would sit there in the booths and just be entertained.
Yeah, that was your evening's entertainment.
Evening entertainment. It cost us nothing, but there
kind
were
of like Night Court on TV there.
It's
with,
like it.
Harry Anderson. There.
Right. It's something very much like that, and you had projects always. Brooklyn was in its infancy in terms of being built. Huge projects, in the 50s and early 60s. The biggest probably was the Verrazano Bridge. It's the largest single suspension bridge in the world. And
it's interesting. I mean, and it is. I thought you were going to say the Brooklyn Bridge, which
No.
in and of itself was.
But that goes back a long time and has unbelievable stories, both from a safety point of view of the workers to not so safe, to where many men died as the build.
They were learning on the job.
Learning on the job, right? Reminds you of the Hoover Dam in Arizona, where those projects were very dangerous. But Brooklyn was growing. Manhattan, and the skyscrapers were being built rapidly. So many centers of commerce were located in Manhattan in New York, which was just, across the river from Brooklyn. So many Brooklynites worked in Manhattan as a way of earning a living.
Now, how, or maybe I should say, when did Brooklyn become a borough?
That's a good question. I can't give you a year, but sometime from the formation of New York as a city in the early days, it was decided that the city would be divided into 5 communities, and Brooklyn being one, the Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island. Is that 5?
Yeah.
Might be already 5. Were formed. They each had their own government. They each had their own borough president. They had their own budgets. And so they were very independent of each other. But as time went by, they realized more and more how dependent they were on each other for resources that they had to share. So I think it also helped in bringing about a community feeling, even though it was such a large populated area.
So was Brooklyn a borough when you were growing up?
It was a borough. Oh yeah, it goes.
I mean, does this go back to the 19th century, or
Probably, yeah. I would say it goes back to the formation, the original formation of New York, the greater New York area. Then you had the airports that were being built. It used to be LaGuardia Airport, and then changed the name to Kennedy International Airport. Then you had, not LaGuardia, I'm sorry, JFK.
That was Idlewild.
That was Idlewild. Then you had LaGuardia built, and then, out on the island, they built a rather large airport, and again, it increased the commerce of the city, the hustle and bustle of life, which
That's something people lose track of. I mean, there are other larger airports, singular airports
Yes.
now.
That's right.
But New York is serviced by 3 airports.
Three
I
of them,
mean, you
yeah.
got Newark.
Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK. And each one of them are very large airports, and service enormous numbers of flights a day, which is why there's always now, in the recent past, concerns about air traffic controlling and are the flights safe, and with so many flights coming and going.
Well, if you're on the Jersey Turnpike,
Yes.
and you're near Newark,
Right.
and the planes coming in, it's
One after another.
it's clockwork.
That's right. My brother, who was very much involved in aviation, loved planes from the day he was born. And what he used to do when he was about 12 years old, my parents bought him an aluminum rowboat, like a little rowboat with a tiny outboard engine. He would take that little boat from Sheepshead Bay, go out to JFK, which was Idlewild in those days, throw down his anchor, and just spend the day watching the planes land, one after another after another. He eventually became a pilot for the airlines, and then went into his own aviation business. But he was one of the first to really pay attention to all of these planes landing one at a time, and just 24/7. Busy place.
Now, as a youth growing up in Brooklyn, would you say, now looking back, because you've been other places, you've been in
Sure.
Southeastern Connecticut, lived in Arizona, and your station in life, I suspect, you've done well, reasonably well. And is that, would you say that the housing that you were growing up in have been tenement housing of sorts, and that, because Brooklyn right now seems to be in a bit of a renaissance. Things are
Absolutely.
changing rapidly, and it's
really hot. I mean, certain sections of Brooklyn are almost as expensive to live in as Manhattan, which is astronomical. And but when I grew up, again, there were a lot of ethnic communities. There was low-income housing. There was tenement housing. There were just plain old apartment buildings, and that's what we lived in an apartment building, and then eventually a co-op, which is an offshoot of a condominium, where you own your own apartment, but you don't own the apartment. You only own the square footage of your place, and it's bought and sold that way, which is complicated, and I never fully understood it. But I do know it was called a co-op, a cooperative. And, when you lived and grew up in apartment complexes where there were, in my case, there were 90 apartments in the building I grew up in.
a lot of apartments.
That's a lot of apartments. It was great for trick-or-treating. You don't have to go out in the cold and rain and snow and sleet. You just went from one apartment to another, and it was great. And a nucleus of my friends came from that building. And 3 out of 4 of them I'm still very much in touch with today. So we met each other when we were in kindergarten. So that's a long time ago.
That's amazing. Had Robert Moses started to
Oh,
have
yes, yes.
his impact on Brooklyn during your time there
Enormous.
as a young man?
Absolutely.
Or a young boy, even?
Yes, absolutely. Moses was very powerful. And some people believe he was more powerful than the mayor, who was Robert Wagner in those days.
He goes
And,
back to LaGuardia.
And to LaGuardia. And to LaGuardia as well.
I read The Power Broker. But
Oh, you did read it. Okay. That was a good book. And, Moses was technically the head of Parks and Recreation, but he was also responsible for roads. And as Brooklyn...
Bridges. And bridges.
And bridges, that's right. And he determined what was going to, how the city was going to grow or not grow. He determined where roads were going to be built and not built. He's responsible for the exodus of many Brooklynites to what is today Long Island, the settlement of Long Island. He developed roads, and during that period of time, cars were selling more and more families could afford cars, and so they could afford to live further and further away from their work. And as that happened, and as he recognized it as being important, he increased the amount of roads that he built going out to Long Island first and
Jones
foremost.
Beach.
Jones Beach, yes. Reese Park, Montauk, even going way out to the tip of Long Island, and also to places like the beginnings of New Jersey, where you needed good roads to get there. And so he was responsible for all of that. But he was also
He was involved at the state level as well.
at the state, right? The
He
community,
was writing legislation that the legislators
absolutely
did not do.
absolutely.
And at the back of them, he'd kind of throw in little curveballs that nobody bothered to read until it
Right.
was too
Well,
late.
if you get back to the Dodgers, if you really read why the Dodgers left and what the circumstances were why they left Brooklyn, it runs right into Robert Moses, because the Dodgers in 1955-56 wanted to stay in Brooklyn. They wanted another ballpark, and they wanted the ballpark where the Long Island Railroad entered Brooklyn, and it would have enabled people who left Brooklyn to go to Long Island to be able to come back easily to see baseball games. And so that's where the Dodgers wanted to build. Still in Brooklyn, but on the path of all the various means of transportation. And Moses wouldn't allow it. He vetoed it. And Walter O'Malley wrote letters to Robert Wagner, constantly trying to get approval for a ballpark in Brooklyn, and he just couldn't do it. Moses offered Queens, where the Mets ended up eventually, but
Along with the '64 World's Fair.
and that's right. And so what happened was a contingent of officials from Los Angeles came to Brooklyn, spoke to Walter O'Malley and the Dodger brass, made them an offer they couldn't refuse in Chavez Ravine, California. And by 1957, the Dodgers were history. And I can't tell you how many 12, 13, 14-year-old boys' hearts were broken. Truly, truly so.
I think it's more than the 12, 13,
Yeah,
14-year-old.
my father too.
My father, who was not, I would say, a big baseball fan, but I mean, he shared with my brother and I that, I mean, that he was a Dodger guy.
Okay.
And that when they went west, the Dodgers left him and he left the Dodgers.
That's
and
right.
He because the Red Sox were in New England, he took
Sure.
the New England
Absolutely.
as the hometown team and
Right.
kind of fell in with the Red Sox.
Now, as long as he didn't go to the Yankees, he's okay.
Well, and he didn't.
But Brooklyn was a unique place. It's still unique, but it was really unique in those times, in the 40s, 50s, and mid-60s. You rarely run into somebody who doesn't have a soft spot in their heart for Brooklyn. You know, and of course World War II took the massive numbers of people in Brooklyn, mostly men, out fighting all over the world. And so Brooklyn became known to foreigners as well as, you know, members of the U.S. population. And so it almost became the most popular community in the world, known by anyone and everyone, just because of people like William Bendix, who played a GI in one of the movies that came out of Brooklyn. And, you know, he portrayed a guy who came from Brooklyn and had a Brooklyn accent, and basically had the value system of Brooklynese.
Now, at what point would you say that Brooklyn, as many urban areas, and we talk about Robert Moses, started to kind of take a bit of a digger? I mean, certain
Right.
neighborhoods, I mean, I think of Bed-Stuy is not exactly a palace
Right.
area, at least a handful of decades ago.
That turned in the 70s, started to turn.
That's 50 years ago.
That's 50 years ago. And again, schools were great, but in certain communities, poor communities, they weren't funded as well as in other communities. And those communities that had school systems that were starting to struggle and even fail were indicators of what the future was going to be like. And it tended to be black and Hispanic communities that had the brunt of, I think, far less resources available to them than some other communities in Brooklyn. And sociology, you could almost trace the decline of a community by how the school systems did or did not accommodate their students. And places like Bedford-Stuy and parts of Harlem, certainly, outside of Brooklyn, but still nearby, started to show signs of stress and strain. And they're still going through that. We've never really solved that problem.
So even with the actually renaissance of both Harlem and Brooklyn.
That's right.
There are still areas that have not caught up or are still trying to get on the bandwagon.
Trying to, that's right. And those parts of Harlem or Bedford-Stuy or Brooklyn that are thriving, you know, they've been gentrified. So what happens is a neighborhood now becomes popular among the upper middle class and wealthier, who now say, well, I want to live in this section of Brooklyn, and it's not in great shape. They buy out the poorer people that live there and renovate the buildings and live there and live a much more expensive lifestyle. But of course, what happens to the people who once lived there? Where do they go? They double and triple up with their friends and relatives. So instead of being in an apartment that's made for one family, now they're in an apartment where there's 3 and 4 families. What do you think is going to happen to that property? It's going to not be able to withstand.
Can't support it.
Can't support it. And it becomes a slum itself. So what wasn't a slum becomes a slum. And we haven't really faced that music very well.
Gentrification is not a very popular word.
Yes.
Just as a quick tangent, but I mean, London's going through this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
With the urban renewal areas where we have these very large apartment buildings that are high end.
Right.
And the local populace beyond their reach.
Can't afford it. That's right. That's right.
And the folks moving in are designed for singles or young couples or
Right.
empty nesters, but not with families.
Right. And there's no guarantee they're going to stay.
That's correct. And they're not going to put roots down and become, part of the community.
Citizens, right, right. That was some of the advantages of private home ownership in Brooklyn in the early days, but also these co-ops. You can get into an apartment very inexpensively, and yet you knew you owned the square footage of the place that you're living in. You kept it up, You couldn't afford to go anywhere else, so you made sure that you took care of it, and people supported each other that way. Something like that maybe needs to be done in the more urban neighborhoods that are faltering so much.
Yeah. One last question on Brooklyn, and that is they now house a professional basketball team.
Right.
Now, from your perspective, you haven't lived there in a long time.
Right.
Can you envision the love affair with the Brooklyn Nets that the Dodgers enjoyed?
No.
No.
No. And ironically, that's exactly where the Brooklyn Dodgers wanted to build their stadium, where the Nets are now playing. That's exactly where it was old train tracks. It was desolate factories that were not in business for 50 years. That's where the Dodgers wanted to build their stadium. And now, ironically, the Brooklyn Nets are there.
Yeah. Well, the Nets have never really had, for my money, what you might call a home. I mean, they
No.
started.
Yeah,
They've been in New Jersey. They've been in Newark. They've been in Long Island.
Right.
They've had 5 or 6 homes.
Yeah, they're very itinerant, for sure. But
then you grow up and you go to college.
right, and in my generation, the vast majority of kids that grew up, went to college, didn't return to Brooklyn. Very, very few. Most settled all over the country.
Yeah, the proverbial brain drain.
It was a brain drain, yeah, to a large extent. It's
So
true.
where did you go to school?
I went to Southern Connecticut State University
In New Haven.
in New Haven, and I stayed in Connecticut for the next 22, 23 years, and ended up getting my first really professional job in New London as a city planner, and stayed well until I was, in my my late 50s when we moved to Arizona for 21 years, and now we're back.
Well, you came into New London as a planner, and I know that, at that time, urban renewal was hot in New London, and Frank
Yeah.
Driscoll had been brought in to oversee this from Syracuse.
Oversee all the money that was coming in.
Tens of millions of dollars.
A lot of money has come in and out of New London. I don't know where it was spent necessarily. There's not too many signs of it. But yeah, urban renewal was pushed by Lyndon Johnson, and his administration.
Yeah, but New London, as that fact, with the research I've done, it really did not qualify
No.
for it. We're too small.
That's right.
And the original plans were for rather large urban areas to be the test cases.
Exactly. Model cities, which is what I was responsible to work for as a city planner, was originally supposed to be somewhere between 5 and 8 major cities in the country where social problems would be identified, and a lot of money to those 5 or 6 or 7 cities would go to try to solve the economic and social problems of those neighborhoods. What ended up happening, though, before you can get it through Congress, every congressman and senator said, I want to have a model cities neighborhood in my district. So what ended up being, instead of 5 or 7, ended up being like 60. And the amount of money didn't change. It had to be divided that many ways. So it kind of didn't have a chance from the beginning. You don't know. Maybe if 5 or 6 communities were well funded and carefully planned out, maybe it would have shown some signs of progress. But it never had the chance. And then, of course, as typical of presidential elections, if you're a president, you try to implement your ideas, but it takes years to do. And if you lose the next election, the guy who beat you ran on a platform why your ideas were so bad. So when they come in, they have their ideas. And so you never fully get it. Good ideas don't have necessarily a chance to fulfill itself. And I think that Model Cities was a good example of that.
Now, how long were you involved with Model Cities in New London?
Just a year and a half. And I really wanted to teach at the college level. And I was able to, after a year and a half, get a position offered to me by Mitchell College to teach sociology in the sociology
Bob
department.
Weller was at the helm there.
Bob Weller was the president of Mitchell College at the time, and the whole time that I was there. And I took the job quickly. I knew it was something I really, really wanted to do, and I really enjoyed it. And I did it for 5 years before becoming the director of Big Brothers and Big Sisters, which I did together with Mitchell College. I was the half-time director of Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and I was the full-time teaching at Mitchell. But when you teach at a college, you know, you're only teaching 2 or 3 days a week, 3 days a week. So you have a lot of free time. So I used my free time to convince the board of Big Brothers and Big Sisters that they needed a director.
So Big Brothers and Big Sisters in New London / Southeastern Connecticut was already up and running
Yes.
when you moved in.
But it was having financial problems.
Now, were you their first paid executive director?
No. Charlie Kiernan, who was a selectman from Old Lyme, was the first executive director. But after a few years, the agency started to have financial issues. And I was hired while I was at Mitchell College by the United Way to evaluate those agencies serving youth and how they were doing with United Way dollars, to evaluate it. So I did all the youth serving programs from the United Way, and one of them was Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And thus I learned quickly that they were having financial difficulties. And what they really could afford was a half-time director, not a full-time director, to slowly build the agency back up. And I offered my services, and they accepted it. And so I stayed at both Mitchell College and Big Brothers and Big Sisters for a number of years.
Well, they were both well served.
I hope so.
Well, I think so. I mean, that's where I met you, is when
That's
you
right.
were at Big Brothers as the executive director.
Right.
And as I recall, I mean, I was in my mid to late 20s. I was still single,
Right.
and I came in to be a big.
That's right.
And I was a little bit surprised because it wasn't a case of where you just walk in, sign up, and they
walk-
hand you a kid.
You don't walk out with a kid. That's right. You got to go through
Which I
something.
was expecting.
Yes. Yes. Well,
But I mean, you know, you have to learn.
you have to learn. You gotta do background checks. You gotta do police checks. You have to interview potential Big Brothers and Big Sisters to be sure that they could be compatible with the child. And you're also interviewing the children, and you're introducing the parent who is responsible for that child. So it's a long, complicated process. It takes a couple of months for it to
That
come
was
to
then. I
fruition.
suspect it may be more
Maybe
challenging now.
Probably more challenging now. You're absolutely right.
But I guess that's where I met you, and I mentioned to you about a surprise before we came on the air. Now, literally, it was fortuitous
All
that
right.
yesterday,
Yes.
a young man who I haven't seen in probably 40 years,
Wow.
my first little
Little
brother,
brother.
shows up at Ace Hardware.
No kidding.
And I'm looking at him and saying, I know this guy. He's bigger than I am. I'm taller, big, husky young man. Young man, he's in his mid-50s.
Wow. Isn't that amazing?
And I wasn't 100% positive, but as I do with his policy, to ask all customers if they're an ACE member. And he goes, yeah, and his name pops up. He says, I know you. And he goes, he looks at me, and he came back today for something else.
Oh, that's
It's
great.
amazing. But I mean, and he came from a very challenging
Background.
and we had difficulty getting together, quite frankly, and we moved on, and I had another young man,
Right.
and that young man, he also came from a pretty challenging background, but he was able to kind of, I think, keep it together. He had an older brother who was in and out of trouble with the loss. I mean, it was
Oh.
not the environments are not. This is not Ozzie and Harriet.
No, that's for sure. None of them are. If it was, we wouldn't be needing to serve them. I have a short, interesting story to tell you, which I'm always most proud of anything I've done in my life. How I met my little brother. In 1967, when I was a senior at Southern Connecticut State College in those days, not university, I was doing volunteer work at the YMCA. And I'm there one day, and the director says, we're forming a new program, a Big Brothers, Big Sisters type program. And we wonder if you would like to be considered to be matched with a young man. And I said, well, let me think about it. I gave it a couple of days, and I said, sure, I'll be glad to. Well, about a week later, he gives me a piece of paper, and a name is on it, and an address.
That's what I was expecting.
Just what you were expecting. And he said, whenever you get a chance, here's the phone number, call John's mother and make arrangements to go out to their apartment and meet them. So I call and make an appointment to come out the next week. And sure enough, it's the dead of winter. It starts snowing. And it is snowing and snowing. And I have my little Beetle, my Volkswagen Beetle. And I just about make it to their house in New Haven. And this little boy is sitting at the steps. And I get out of the car and I walk up to him and he says, are you going to be my big brother? I said, yes, I am. So he invites me into the house and I meet his mother and his two sisters. And it's still snowing and snowing and snowing. And I had dinner with them and it was time for me to leave. I just met them for the first time. Well, I couldn't get my car out of the spot. It was in so much snow. So I ended up spending the night. Can you imagine, first time you meet your little brother, you end up spending the night? Well, we had pillow fights and we played games, and it was just, what it was accomplishing that one night would have taken me 5 years to have accomplished, to get to know them and to get to know me. And here we are now in 2025, my little brother, who I'm as close to as anybody in my life other than my wife, and my kids, is now 67 years old, a grandchild. He just had his second grandchild a couple of weeks ago, and we're family. And it's just been a wonderful experience.
And yours is what you can sell and build on.
That's right.
They're not every match ends up
happening that way.
A fairy tale, so to speak.
That's right. It's been a fairy tale. It has been. And I just felt very fortunate. Now, I should say, too, I was matched once, many years later. I wanted to become a big brother, big sister to a child again. I did. And that match did not work out at all. Drugs got involved in the problem, and it just didn't work. It didn't work out. So there's no guarantees.
Yeah. But one of the things, and you and I and a mutual friend of ours, Jerry Rucci,
Yes.
we discuss often when we're together what programs are available and what are the needs, and
That's
are they
right.
being met?
Right.
That Big Brothers and related programs are providing.
Right.
That are outside of the realm of government. I don't necessarily think
Right.
the government's doing a Cadillac job meeting
No,
these
it's not.
needs.
No, never has. Never has. It seems to, the private sector seems to have the capacity to do it. It needs the resources, though, to do it, and that often becomes a big problem. I know we could have served probably another 100, 200 kids a year if we had the resources at the time to do it. We just didn't have it, But
And there always seems to be a need for the young boys to have that hopefully stabilizing, mature influence.
right, a male role model is needed. And in more and more cases, we're learning that girls need it as well. Often they're all from single-parent homes. Often the father is absent, and not involved in the children's lives. The mom is working, sometimes more than one job even, trying to make ends meet. And she needs help not only for her sons, but her daughters as well. And which is why the Big Sisters program came about and has been very successful. I mean, women are great volunteers. They really, really are. And we've had some wonderful matches that were made.
Well, I think in Southeastern Connecticut, I mean, again, when I started many years ago, the office servicing the area was in New London on Whale Oil Road.
That's right.
Which just my own personal observation, you were kind of central to the issues and
Right.
and the need.
And where the kids lived.
That's correct. And I don't recall at what point in time, but there was a decision made to relocate to Groton.
To Groton.
And I think by that time, you and Jerry, who was also a director,
Right.
were no longer with the program.
Right.
And other moves and changes were made, and I think their last office was up in Chesterfield or
Yeah.
between Chesterfield.
Montville.
I think
Uncasville.
Chesterfield's in Montville on,
Yes.
on 85.
On 85, which in my mind never made any sense at all. None of the population you were serving is nearby. How do mothers and get to the office if they don't have transportation? There's no public transportation to go out there. You had to be in, certainly in Groton and New London. Maybe an outside place would have been Norwich as well. But we had an office in Norwich, and we had a part-time office in Groton when we were full-time in New London.
Yeah. But I know that at the time that the services were being provided in New London in particular, that I think there was a higher degree of effectiveness and service and reinforcement to the adults and the children.
Yes, you have to.
You can't follow up. You just don't throw people together and say, "Well, have fun."
Right. That's why you had
Be
a case.
success.
That's why there was a caseworker for every match, and the caseworker would be in touch with the big, as we call them, and the little, and make sure that things are going smoothly. And if not, if there's problems, it was up to the caseworker of the agency to help work to resolve them.
Yeah. Now, I know in recent time in New London, they've had an office for a Boys and Girls Club.
Yes.
And that was in one of the three high-rises that have since been torn down under
Yes.
the bridge
Yes.
on Crystal Avenue. And then they moved into a one or two units in one of the apartments on Federal Street.
Okay.
And the executive director at the time decided that she had enough and resigned. And that program has been absorbed now by the local Salvation Army, which has got their facilities on the corner of Governor Winthrop Boulevard
Right.
and Union Street. And I'm not sure who else is providing
Much
those
service.
types of youth services.
Yeah, not much that I know of, and it is a shame. And the truth is, probably a viable Boys and Girls Club would be the best of agencies to rise in the greater New London area, in that as long as it had a facility. But again, we're talking about money. But if it was a building and it was a pool,
They never had a facility. They had an office, and everything was outreach.
right?
Kind of like the YMCA after it was closed
That's
on,
right.
on Meridian Street.
Right. I remember that. I was a member.
And they had a home office, and all the programming was hither and yon.
Right. If you had a building, a real building like many communities across the country have, Boys and Girls Clubs, where all kinds of programs and services are delivered, it would be a perfect place for a Big Brothers Big Sisters agency to be housed in a Boys and Girls Club. Why not? All you need is an office, and you can run a program. And yet the kids who come to you can also use the facility as a Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah. Well, New London is in the process of based on projections, opening a brand new rec center
Right.
down in Fort Trumbull. The facility is pretty large, but I'm not sure what the programming is going to look like, or if it's
Right.
going to meet, even remotely look with some of the things you've been outlining
Right.
in this discussion.
Yeah, is the emphasis going to be on adults? Is it going to be part-time on kids or minimal time for kids? How are kids going to get there? Has that been
I'm not sure.
discussed? It's great that they're going to have a facility, which means that somebody's going to benefit, hopefully, from it. But I would certainly hope that there would be a strong consideration for kids, particularly in the elementary through middle school years.
I agree. Well, I'll tell you, we're getting down near the nitty-gritty here,
Okay.
and I just want to say thank you for carving out the better part of an hour to chew the fat with an old friend.
It was very much enjoyable. I enjoyed every minute of it, Marty.
And I don't think we can't give up hope. It's kind of
No.
like Murray Renshaw says about New London. It's the town that's too tough to die.
Too tough to die. Well, I'd agree with that. It's still here.
And you can't quit. I mean,
No.
there are those who have questioned me from time to time. Why do you do what you do, or why have you done what you've done politically?
Right.
I said, well, I live here, and
That's
I grew
right.
up here, and
It's your home.
I haven't quit on the town yet.
No, you haven't, and you never will. I know that.
So, but it's been fun, and we should do this again.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you again
You're
for
welcome.
coming on. Folks, you've been watching City Focus, and I'm Marty Olsen, your host, and we've had a delightful conversation with Bob Bernstein, a longtime friend. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next week. Good night.